Eleanor Ashford woke before dawn on the morning of her wedding, her heart caught somewhere between fragile hope and an unnamed dread she could not shake. The pale light of an October morning crept through the worn curtains of her bedroom, illuminating the wedding dress that hung from the wardrobe door like a ghost waiting to be inhabited. It was a simple gown. No French lace, no seed pearls, nothing that would make the society pages whisper with envy. Her family could not afford such luxuries, but Eleanor had sewn tiny white roses along the neckline herself, working by candlelight through sleepless nights, and she thought it beautiful in its modesty. She rose from bed and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. Below, London was stirring, servants rushing through back alleys, coal smoke beginning to rise from chimneys, the distant clatter of carriages on cobblestones. Somewhere out there, Lord Geoffrey Blackwood was waking in his townhouse, preparing to become her husband. She did not love him, not truly, but she had learned to find comfort in his predictability, in the security he represented. Geoffrey was handsome enough, polite enough, wealthy enough to save her family from the creditors circling like vultures. He would give her children, a home, a purpose. It was more than Eleanor had ever dared to hope for. The plain sister, the invisible daughter, the one who managed the household accounts while her younger sister Rosalind danced at balls and collected admirers like flowers. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Rosalind entered without waiting for permission, already dressed in a gown of pale blue silk that made her golden hair glow and her eyes sparkle like sapphires. She was breathtaking, as always. Eleanor felt the familiar pang of inadequacy that had shadowed her entire life. "Let me help you dress," Rosalind said, her voice sweet as honey. But there was something strange in her eyes, a glittering excitement that seemed too bright, too eager. Eleanor attributed it to the emotion of the day. As Rosalind buttoned the back of the wedding gown, her fingers lingered longer than necessary. "Are you nervous, sister?" "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. Rosalind's reflection smiled in the mirror, but it did not reach her eyes. "You should be." Before Eleanor could ask what she meant, their mother burst into the room, all nervous energy and complaints about the florist and the weather and the state of society in general. The moment passed, unexamined. St. George's Church in Hanover Square was filled with the cream of London society, not because anyone particularly cared for Eleanor Ashford, but because a wedding was entertainment, and the ton was always hungry for something to watch and whisper about. Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her bouquet of white roses trembling in her grip. She kept her eyes fixed on the altar, on the priest waiting with his prayer book, on the space where Geoffrey should have been standing. But Geoffrey was not there. The altar was empty. Eleanor stopped walking. Her father tugged at her arm impatiently, but she could not move. The whispers began immediately, a rising tide of shocked murmurs that filled the church like the hissing of snakes. 5 minutes passed. 10. Eleanor stood frozen at the front of the church, her face burning, her heart turning to stone inside her chest. And then the church doors opened. It was not Geoffrey alone who entered. It was Geoffrey with Rosalind on his arm, Rosalind radiant in her blue dress, her golden hair cascading over her shoulders, her hand possessively wrapped around the arm of Eleanor's fiancé. They walked up the aisle together, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if Eleanor did not exist, as if the entire congregation were not gaping in disbelief. "Forgive us," Rosalind announced, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "But the heart wants what it wants. Geoffrey and I are in love. We have been for months. We could not continue this deception any longer." Eleanor heard the words, but they seemed to come from very far away. She looked at Geoffrey, at the man who had kissed her hand, who had promised her a future, who had smiled at her with what she thought was affection. He would not meet her eyes. His jaw was clenched, his face pale, but he did not pull away from Rosalind. He did not deny it. He did not apologize. Something inside Eleanor shattered. She could feel it breaking. All her hopes, all her carefully constructed dreams, all her belief that perhaps she deserved happiness after all. The whispers around her grew louder, crueler. She heard someone laugh. Someone else called her poor thing in a tone dripping with pity and satisfaction. But Eleanor Ashford did not cry. She did not scream. She did not collapse. Instead, she straightened her spine. She handed her bouquet to her mother, who was too shocked to do anything but take it, and then, with the dignity of a queen walking to her own execution, Eleanor turned and walked back down the aisle, alone, her chin high, her eyes dry. Each step an act of defiance against every person who expected her to crumble. In the back pew, a man watched her pass. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and eyes the color of a winter sky. Prince Alexander Maximilian Cavendish Wettin had attended this wedding only out of diplomatic obligation, expecting nothing but tedium. But as he watched this woman, this ordinary, unremarkable woman who had just been publicly destroyed, walk out of the church with more grace and courage than he had ever witnessed, something stirred in his chest that he had thought long dead. He rose from his seat and followed her. Outside, Eleanor allowed herself one moment of weakness. She leaned against the cold stone wall of the church and let a single tear fall down her cheek. Just one. That was all she would permit. "Forgive my intrusion," said a voice behind her, deep, cultured, with a slight accent she could not place. "But I could not let a woman of such extraordinary courage walk alone. May I offer you my carriage?" Eleanor turned to find a stranger watching her with an expression she did not recognize. It was not pity. It was not mockery. It was something else entirely, something that looked almost like admiration. "I do not know you, sir," she managed. "My name is Alexander," he said simply, "and you are the bravest woman I have ever seen. Please, allow me this small kindness." She should have refused. She should have waited for her family's carriage, should have maintained propriety, should have remembered every rule she had been taught about speaking to strange men. But something in his eyes, in the gentle certainty of his voice, made her take his offered hand. The carriage ride was silent. Alexander did not ask questions. He did not offer platitudes or false comfort. He simply sat across from her in the darkened interior and allowed her to exist in her grief without demanding anything from her. It was the greatest gift anyone had given Eleanor in as long as she could remember. When the carriage stopped in front of the Ashford townhouse, a once grand building now showing signs of genteel decay, Alexander helped her down with careful formality. His hand was warm through her glove, solid, steady. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, "for not asking." "There was nothing to ask," he replied. "What happened today was a display of weakness and cruelty, but not on your part. Never on your part." And then he was gone, the carriage rolling away down the street, and Eleanor was left standing alone on her doorstep, holding only the memory of a stranger's kindness and the strange warmth of his hand in hers. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her darkened bedroom, while chaos reigned below. Her mother's hysterics, her father's drunken bellowing, the servants whispering in corners. Rosalind and Geoffrey had fled to Gretna Green immediately after their announcement, seeking a Scottish marriage that would legitimize their betrayal. By morning, the scandal would be in every newspaper and on every tongue in London. The Ashfords were ruined. But Eleanor could not bring herself to care about the scandal. She kept thinking about the stranger, Alexander, and the way he had looked at her without pity. In her 23 years, no man had ever looked at her the way he had. As if she were worthy of admiration, as if she were someone worth seeing. It was only when a maid brought her morning tea, along with a small cream-colored card on a silver tray, that Eleanor realized she had not been dreaming. The card was thick, expensive, embossed with a royal crest. The name printed upon it made Eleanor's hands tremble. His Royal Highness, Prince Alexander Maximilian Cavendish Wettin. Below, in elegant handwriting, "Would you do me the honor of accompanying me for a drive in Hyde Park this afternoon? I will call at 3 o'clock if you are willing." Her mother nearly fainted when she saw the card. Her father emerged from his study for the first time in 12 hours, suddenly sober and calculating. The daughter they had overlooked for years was suddenly their most valuable asset, a woman who had somehow attracted the attention of a prince. "You will wear your green silk," her mother commanded, already transformed from grief-stricken matriarch to social tactician, "and you will be charming. You will be everything a prince could want." "I will be myself," Eleanor replied quietly. "If that is not enough, then nothing will be." At precisely 3 o'clock, a gleaming black carriage arrived at the Ashford residence. Alexander emerged looking even more striking in daylight, tall and commanding, dressed impeccably but without ostentation, his grey-blue eyes finding Eleanor's immediately as she descended the steps. "Miss Ashford," he said, bowing over her hand, "I was not certain you would agree to see me." "I was not certain you were real," she admitted. "I thought perhaps I had imagined you." His lips curved into a small smile. "I assure you, I am quite real, though I confess I sometimes wish otherwise." Hyde Park was crowded with the fashionable set, ladies in their finest walking dresses, gentlemen on horseback, children with their nursemaids. Every eye turned to watch as Prince Alexander's carriage passed, and every eye saw Eleanor Ashford beside him. The whispers began immediately, the woman abandoned at the altar, the sister betrayed, and now, with a prince. "They are all staring," Eleanor murmured, her cheeks flushing. "Let them stare," Alexander replied. "They see a scandal." "I see the most interesting woman in London." Eleanor turned to look at him, surprised. "You do not know me, Your Highness. You cannot possibly find me interesting." "Then tell me about yourself," he said. "Not the gossip, not the scandal. Tell me who you are. What books do you read? What makes you laugh? What do you dream about when no one is watching?" No one had ever asked Eleanor such questions. She found herself talking, hesitantly at first, then more freely, about her love of poetry, her secret sketches of imaginary gardens, her belief that every person deserved to be seen for who they truly were. Alexander listened with genuine attention, asking questions, laughing at her observations, sharing his own thoughts about duty and loneliness and the weight of expectations. By the time the carriage returned to Hanover Square, something had shifted between them. Eleanor felt for the first time in her life that someone truly saw her, not as the plain sister, not as the failed bride, but as herself. "May I call on you again?" Alexander asked as he helped her down from the carriage. "Why?" The question escaped before Eleanor could stop it. "Why me? You could have any woman in Europe. Why would you spend your time with a ruined woman from a disgraced family?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes searching her face. "Because, Guy," he said finally, "in that church, when everything was falling apart around you, you did not break. You did not rage or weep or beg. You simply walked away with your dignity intact. I have met queens and princesses, Miss Ashford. None of them possess a fraction of your courage." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her gloved fingers, a gesture that was entirely proper and yet felt devastatingly intimate. "Until tomorrow," he said. And Eleanor watched him go, her heart beating faster than it had ever beat for Geoffrey Blackwood. In the weeks that followed, Prince Alexander became a fixture in Eleanor's life and in the gossip columns of every newspaper in London. They were seen together at the opera, at gallery openings, at teas and dinners and balls. Society could not decide what to make of it. Was the prince merely amusing himself with a fallen woman? Was this some elaborate scheme? Or was it possible, scandalously, impossibly possible, that a royal prince was genuinely courting the woman who had been left at the altar by her own sister's treachery? Eleanor herself did not know what to believe. Every moment with Alexander felt like a dream from which she would inevitably wake. He was kind, intelligent, genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. He made her laugh in ways she had forgotten she could, and when their eyes met across a crowded room, when his hand brushed against hers during a dance, when he leaned close to whisper some observation meant only for her, Eleanor felt something awakening inside her that she had long believed dead. But Rosalind's words echoed in her mind like a curse. The night before the wedding, her sister had helped her dress with those strange, glittering eyes. You should be nervous. Had Rosalind known even then what she planned to do? Had she looked at Eleanor in her wedding dress and felt nothing but triumph at the destruction she was about to cause? The Austrian ambassador's ball was the most anticipated event of the season. Alexander had secured Eleanor an invitation, a feat that required considerable diplomatic maneuvering given her scandalous status. She wore a gown of deep emerald green, borrowed from a sympathetic cousin, and when she descended the stairs to find Alexander waiting in the foyer, the look on his face stopped her breath. "You are beautiful," he said simply. Not a flowery compliment, not an elaborate flattery, just 3 words spoken with absolute sincerity. "I am adequate," Eleanor corrected, her cheeks warming. "Rosalind is beautiful. I am—" "You are beautiful," Alexander repeated firmly. "And I will spend the rest of my life convincing you of it if necessary." The ball was a glittering affair, crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, the finest orchestra in London playing waltzes that seemed designed to make hearts race. Eleanor felt the weight of every stare as she entered on Alexander's arm, but she lifted her chin and met their gazes without flinching. She had survived worse than curiosity. She had survived betrayal. The first dance was a waltz, Alexander led her onto the floor with practiced grace, and when his hand settled on her waist, Eleanor felt the touch like fire through the silk of her gown. They moved together in perfect synchrony, and for a moment the rest of the world fell away. "You dance as if you were waiting for something terrible to happen," Alexander observed quietly. "I am waiting to wake up," Eleanor admitted. "This is not a dream." "Then what is it?" She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for answers. "What are we doing, Alexander? What is this?" Before he could answer, a drunken voice cut through the music. The Earl of Pemberton, red-faced and swaying, had stepped onto the dance floor directly in their path. "Well, well," he slurred, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The prince and his charity case. Tell me, Your Highness, what is it like to dance with damaged goods?" The music stumbled to a halt. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She had prepared herself for whispers, for sideways glances, but not for this, not for public humiliation twice in as many months. But before she could react, Alexander stepped forward. His face had gone cold, his eyes hard as winter ice. He did not raise his voice, he did not need to. The quiet menace in his tone carried across the suddenly silent ballroom. "Lord Pemberton," he said softly, "I suggest you apologize to Miss Ashford immediately. And then I suggest you leave this ball and never speak of her again in anything less than reverent tones. Because if I hear otherwise, if I hear even a whisper of disrespect toward this woman, I will ensure that you never receive an invitation to any event of consequence for the remainder of your miserable existence." The Earl's face went from red to white. He stammered an apology and fled the ballroom, leaving behind a stunned silence that gradually gave way to murmurs of shock and speculation. Alexander turned back to Eleanor and offered his hand as if nothing had happened. "Shall we continue our dance?" Eleanor took his hand, trembling. No one had ever defended her before. No one had ever thought she was worth defending. Later, on the terrace overlooking the ambassador's gardens, they stood together under the stars. The night air was cold, but Eleanor barely felt it. She was too aware of Alexander beside her, the warmth of his proximity, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Why did you do that?" she asked softly. "You could have simply ignored him. You did not have to defend me." "Yes," Alexander said. "I did." He turned to face her, and in the moonlight, his eyes were silver. "Eleanor, I need you to understand something. What I feel for you is not pity. It is not charity. It is not some passing fancy or diplomatic maneuver. Then what is it?" He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so tender that Eleanor's heart clenched. "I do not know," he admitted. "I only know that when I am with you I feel more myself than I have in years. You do not see a prince when you look at me. You see Alexander. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know how lonely it is to be surrounded by people who only see a crown?" Eleanor reached up and placed her hand over his heart. She could feel it beating fast beneath her palm, faster than she expected, as if he were as nervous as she was. "I see you," she whispered. "I see Alexander." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her cheek. Their lips were inches apart. Eleanor's eyes fluttered closed, and then voices approached from inside, and they sprang apart like guilty children. The moment shattered, leaving behind only the memory of what might have been and the promise of what was still to come. News travelled fast in London society, and by the following morning, everyone knew what had happened at the ambassador's ball, the prince's defence of his scandalous companion, the Earl's humiliation, the whispered almost moment on the terrace. Speculation reached a fever pitch. Was the prince truly in love with the abandoned bride? Would there be a royal proposal? The gossip sheets could talk of nothing else. But there was one person in London who did not find the news amusing at all. Rosalind Blackwood, for she was Lady Blackwood now, having secured her hasty Scottish marriage, read the morning papers with a growing sense of disbelief and fury. She had expected Eleanor to disappear into obscurity, to wither away in shame and solitude. Instead, her plain, forgettable sister was being courted by a prince. A prince. "This is absurd," she hissed, throwing the newspaper across the breakfast table. What could he possibly see in her? Geoffrey, her husband of 3 weeks, did not look up from his eggs. Their honeymoon had been brief and disappointing. Geoffrey was distracted, irritable, and far more interested in his gambling debts than in his new wife. Rosalind was beginning to realize that she had traded one prison for another. "Perhaps he sees what you refuse to see," Geoffrey muttered. "A good woman," Rosalind's eyes narrowed dangerously. "What did you say?" "Nothing, my dear." Geoffrey stood and gathered his coat. "I am going to my club. Do not wait up." He left without kissing her goodbye. Rosalind sat alone in the small, shabby dining room of their rented townhouse, a far cry from the grand estates she had imagined, and felt hatred curdle in her stomach like spoiled milk. Eleanor did not deserve this happiness. Eleanor had always been weak, passive, accepting. Rosalind had done the world a favor by taking Geoffrey. She had saved her sister from a loveless marriage to a man who would never truly want her. And this was her reward, to watch Eleanor rise while she herself sank. No, she would not allow it. The society tea at Lady Whitmore's was one of the few invitations Rosalind still received. Her status as a newlywed provided a thin veneer of respectability over the scandal of her elopement. She arrived in her finest dress, her smile sharp as broken glass, and found exactly what she was looking for: Eleanor, sitting near the window, speaking quietly with two other ladies. Eleanor's face went pale when she saw her sister approach. The other ladies quickly excused themselves, sensing the coming storm. "Sister," Rosalind said sweetly, taking the seat beside Eleanor, "how wonderful to see you. You look, well." "Rosalind," Eleanor's voice was flat, guarded, "I did not expect you. I could not stay away. I have heard such fascinating rumors about you and your prince." Rosalind leaned closer, dropping her voice to a whisper. "You must know he is only toying with you, Eleanor. Men like him do not marry women like us. He is amusing himself with the novelty of a fallen woman, nothing more." Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap, but she did not look away. "And men like Geoffrey, what do they do, Rosalind? Do they make their wives happy?" For a moment something flickered across Rosalind's face, something that might have been pain or regret, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold fury. "You always were naive," Rosalind hissed. "Do you think I regret what I did? I saved you from a man who never loved you, who only wanted your dowry and your compliance. The prince will do the same, use you until he tires of you, and then discard you like yesterday's newspaper. And when that happens, I will be here to watch." She rose gracefully and swept away, leaving Eleanor sitting alone with her sister's poison seeping into her heart. That evening, when Alexander called to take Eleanor to the theatre, he immediately sensed something was wrong. She was quiet, withdrawn, her smiles forced and brittle. "What happened?" he asked softly as their carriage rattled through the darkening streets. "Nothing," Eleanor lied. "I am simply tired." Alexander reached across the space between them and took her hand. "Eleanor, please, do not shut me out." The gentleness in his voice undid her. Eleanor told him everything. Rosalind's words, the fears she had been carrying, the voice in her head that kept whispering that she was not worthy, that this could not last, that she was fooling herself to believe a prince could truly want her. When she finished, Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he ordered the driver to stop and turn around. "We are not going to the theatre tonight," he said. "We are going somewhere else." The carriage took them out of London, through darkening countryside roads, until they arrived at a sprawling estate bathed in moonlight, Thornwood Hall, Alexander's private residence in England. It was magnificent, all honey-coloured stone and climbing roses and windows that glowed with welcoming light. "This is my home," Alexander said, as he helped Eleanor from the carriage. "The only place where I am simply myself, not a title or an obligation. I have never brought anyone here before. I wanted you to see it. I wanted you to understand." Eleanor looked up at the grand house, then back at Alexander. "Understand what?" "That when I am with you," he said quietly, "this is how I feel, like I am home." They spent that evening in the library, surrounded by books and firelight, talking about everything and nothing. Alexander told her about his childhood, the pressure of royal expectations, the loneliness of always being different, the way he had learned to hide his true self behind a mask of diplomatic charm. Eleanor told him about growing up in Rosalind's shadow, about the small cruelties that had shaped her, about the dreams she had long since stopped believing in. "I used to dream of having a garden," she confessed, curled up on a settee with a cup of tea warming her hands. "A wild garden, not the formal kind, somewhere I could grow whatever I wanted, where nothing had to be perfect or proper." "Thornwood has 60 acres of gardens," Alexander said. "I could give you a corner of it, or all of it if you wanted." Eleanor laughed, and then realized he was serious. The way he was looking at her with such open longing made her breath catch. "Alexander," she whispered, "what are you saying?" He moved to sit beside her, close enough that their knees touched. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with devastating tenderness. "I am saying," he murmured, "that I am falling in love with you, Eleanor Ashford. Against all reason, against all expectation, against every rule I have ever been taught about who I should want. I am falling in love with you, and I do not know how to stop." "Then do not stop," Eleanor breathed. And this time, when he leaned in to kiss her, there was no interruption. The kiss began softly, a gentle press of lips, questioning, uncertain. But when Eleanor responded, when her hands came up to grip the lapels of his coat and pull him closer, something broke open between them. The kiss deepened, became desperate, hungry. All the loneliness of their separate lives, all the longing they had been holding back, poured into that single point of contact, until Eleanor thought she might drown in it. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Alexander pressed his forehead to hers. "Tell me this is real," he said hoarsely. "Tell me I am not dreaming." "It is real," Eleanor promised, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. "This is real." They stayed at Thornwood for 3 days. 3 days of walking through autumn gardens, of reading poetry aloud in the library, of stolen kisses and whispered conversations, and the slow, sweet building of something neither of them had expected to find. Eleanor began to believe, despite everything, that perhaps happiness was possible. Perhaps she deserved to be loved. On the morning of the 4th day, a letter arrived for Alexander. He read it with a face gone suddenly pale, and Eleanor knew before he spoke that their fragile peace was about to shatter. "My family," he said quietly. "They have heard rumors about us. They are sending someone to meet me, a potential bride." Eleanor felt the familiar cold of dread settle in her stomach. "A princess. Princess Wilhelmina of Saxony. She arrives next week." Alexander took her hands, his grip almost painful. "Eleanor, this changes nothing. I will explain to her, to my family, that my heart is already spoken for." "Can you do that?" Eleanor asked. "Can a prince truly choose love over duty?" Alexander lifted her hands to his lips and kissed them fiercely. "Watch me," he vowed. "Watch me choose you." Princess Wilhelmina of Saxony arrived in London like a force of nature, beautiful, polished, and absolutely certain of her destiny. She was everything Eleanor was not, tall and willowy, with pale blonde hair and ice-blue eyes, a pedigree that traced back centuries, and the confident grace of a woman who had never known a moment's doubt about her place in the world. The first meeting between the three of them was arranged as a formal tea at the Austrian embassy, diplomatic territory, carefully chosen. Eleanor wore her best dress and held her chin high, but she felt like an imposter beside Wilhelmina's effortless elegance. "So you are the Englishwoman who has captured our Alexander's attention," Wilhelmina said, her accent refined, her smile cool. "How unexpected." "Princess." Eleanor's voice was steady, though her heart was racing. "I hope your journey was pleasant." "Pleasant enough." Wilhelmina's gaze swept over Eleanor with barely concealed disdain. "Though I confess I expected London to offer more. In terms of society, you understand." Alexander, seated between them, had gone very still. "Wilhelmina," he said quietly, a warning in his tone. "Oh, do not worry, cousin." Wilhelmina laughed lightly. "I am sure Miss Ashford is quite charming in her own way. One cannot fault a woman for making the most of her limited circumstances." The tea continued in a similar vein, Wilhelmina dropping barbed comments with a practiced smile, Alexander growing increasingly tense, Eleanor feeling more inadequate with every passing moment. By the time the afternoon ended, she was exhausted and heartsick. In the days that followed, Wilhelmina made herself indispensable. She appeared at every social function Alexander attended, spoke German with him in corners, laughed at jokes Eleanor could not understand. She was charming to everyone except Eleanor, whom she treated with a condescension that cut deeper than outright cruelty. Eleanor watched them together and felt her fragile confidence crumbling. Wilhelmina was right, after all. She was a princess, born to this life, trained for it, perfectly suited to stand beside Alexander. What was Eleanor but a scandal, a charity case, a brief diversion? She began to withdraw. She declined invitations. She spent long hours alone in her room, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she had been foolish to hope. And then, at a dinner party she had not wanted to attend, Eleanor saw something that stopped her heart. Alexander and Wilhelmina were standing in an alcove. partially hidden by heavy curtains. Wilhelmina had her hand on Alexander's arm, her face tilted up toward his, her lips curved in a smile of intimate familiarity. They were speaking in German, their voices too low to hear. Eleanor fled. She found a quiet corner of the garden and stood there, shaking, trying to control the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had known this would happen. She had known it from the beginning. How could she have been foolish enough to believe otherwise? "Eleanor!" Alexander's voice came from behind her. "Eleanor, please, let me explain." She turned to face him, and she did not try to hide the tears streaming down her cheeks. "There is nothing to explain. I saw you with her. I understand." "You understand nothing." Alexander crossed to her in 3 long strides and took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Wilhelmina was saying goodbye. I told her tonight that there will be no engagement between us, that my heart belongs to someone else. She was not pleased, but she accepted it. That is what you saw. Not a beginning, Eleanor. An ending." Eleanor stared at him, wanting desperately to believe him but afraid to hope. "She is a princess. Your family wants—" "I do not care what my family wants." His voice was fierce, his eyes blazing. "I love you. Do you hear me? I love you, Eleanor Ashford. Not despite your past or your family or your so-called scandal. I love you because of who you are. Because you are brave and kind and real in a world full of pretense. Because when I am with you, I am the man I want to be, and I will fight for you. Against my family, against society, against the whole bloody world if necessary. But I cannot fight you too." He pressed his forehead to hers, his breath ragged. "Please," he whispered, "please do not give up on us." Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought of Rosalind's cruelty, of Geoffrey's betrayal, of every moment in her life when she had been taught that she was not enough. And then she thought of Alexander, of his kindness, his passion, the way he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. "I love you," she said finally, the words torn from somewhere deep inside her. "I love you, and it terrifies me. But I do not want to give up. I want to be brave. I want to believe that this can work." Alexander kissed her then, a desperate, claiming kiss that left no doubt about his feelings, and for the first time, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that perhaps she had found her home at last. Just when it seemed that Eleanor and Alexander had finally found their way to each other, Rosalind struck. She arrived at Thornwood Hall uninvited, her face pale and drawn, her dress rumpled from travel. Eleanor found her in the entrance hall, clutching a leather satchel and demanding to see her sister. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor asked warily. "I need to speak with you, alone." Rosalind's eyes darted around the grand foyer. "It is about Geoffrey, about our family, about everything." Eleanor led her sister to a small sitting room, her heart heavy with foreboding. Whatever Rosalind wanted, it would not be good. "Geoffrey has debts," Rosalind said without preamble. "Enormous debts. He has been hiding them from me, from everyone. We are ruined, Eleanor. Truly ruined. He will be sent to debtor's prison if we cannot find the money to pay." Eleanor felt a flash of bitter satisfaction. The man who had abandoned her at the altar was now facing the consequences of his weakness. But the feeling faded quickly. Whatever Geoffrey had done, Rosalind was still her sister. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. Rosalind's mask cracked. For the first time, Eleanor saw real fear in her sister's eyes. "I need you to ask the prince for help. Alone. An introduction to someone who could help. Anything. And if I refuse—" Rosalind's face hardened. She opened the leather satchel and pulled out a bundle of papers. Letters, Eleanor realized. Old letters, written in her own hand. "I found these in Mother's things," Rosalind said coldly. "Letters you wrote as a girl. Letters about your feelings for various men, some of them quite embarrassing. Letters that, if made public, would suggest you are not the innocent woman you have been pretending to be. I do not want to use them, Eleanor, but I will if I have to." Eleanor stared at her sister, this woman who shared her blood, who had slept in the nursery beside her, who had once been her closest companion. How had they come to this? "You would blackmail me," she said slowly. "Your own sister." "I would do what I must to survive." Rosalind's voice was bitter. "You do not understand what it is like, Eleanor. You have always been content with so little, but I need more. I have always needed more, and now I have nothing." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, her spine straight, her chin high, the same posture that had carried her out of St. George's Church on the worst day of her life. "No," she said simply. Rosalind's eyes widened. What? No, Rosalind. I will not ask Alexander to save you from the consequences of your own choices. And those letters? Eleanor smiled faintly. They are the writings of a lonely girl who dreamed of love. If you wish to publish them, go ahead. I am not ashamed of who I was. I am not ashamed of who I am. And I refuse to live my life in fear of your threats. For a moment, Rosalind looked as if Eleanor had struck her. Then her face twisted with rage. Fine, she spat. If you will not help me willingly, I will find another way. I will go to your precious prince myself. I will tell him lies so convincing he will never look at you the same way again. You will do nothing. Alexander's voice came from the doorway. He had heard everything. His face was cold with fury, but his eyes were calm. I know exactly who Eleanor is, Lady Blackwood. I know her heart, her history, her fears. There is nothing you can tell me that will change what I feel for her. He crossed to Eleanor and took her hand, presenting a united front. I think it is time for you to leave, Lady Blackwood, and I suggest you do not return. Rosalind gathered her things with shaking hands. At the door, she turned back one last time, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You always won, did you not, Eleanor? She whispered. Even when you seemed to lose. This was never a competition, Rosalind, Eleanor said softly. I only ever wanted us both to be happy. Rosalind laughed bitterly and walked out into the grey afternoon. Eleanor watched her go, feeling something that surprised her. Not triumph or vindication, but sorrow. Sorrow for the sister she had lost, for the relationship that could never be repaired. Alexander put his arm around her and pulled her close. Are you all right? Eleanor leaned into his strength. I will be, she said. I think, for the first time in my life, I truly will be. In the weeks that followed Rosalind's departure, Alexander made his intentions clear to everyone who mattered. He wrote to his family in Germany, explaining that he had found the woman he wished to marry and that no amount of objection would change his mind. He met with the Queen's representatives, securing permission for a royal match that would raise eyebrows but not require him to renounce his position. He arranged for Eleanor to be received at court, ensuring that society would have no choice but to accept her. But he had not yet asked Eleanor the question that mattered most. He was waiting, he told himself, for the right moment. He wanted it to be perfect, not because Eleanor needed perfection, but because she deserved it. After everything she had endured, after every cruelty and disappointment, he wanted to give her a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. The right moment came on a crisp November evening at Thornwood Hall. The gardens were bare now, the roses sleeping under winter mulch, but Alexander had filled the conservatory with thousands of candles and white flowers imported from warmer climates. The effect was magical, a summer garden blooming in defiance of the cold outside. When Eleanor entered the conservatory, she stopped in her tracks, her hand flying to her heart. Alexander, she breathed. What is this? He stood in the center of the garden he had created for her, surrounded by candlelight and flowers, his heart pounding harder than it ever had before a diplomatic negotiation or state function. This, he said, is what you deserve. Beauty, wonder, magic. He took a deep breath. But more than that, Eleanor, you deserve honesty. So let me be honest. He crossed to her and took both her hands in his. When I first saw you walking out of that church with your dignity intact, when everyone expected you to crumble, I knew that you were different from anyone I had ever met. And the more I learned about you, your kindness, your intelligence, your quiet strength, the more certain I became that I could not imagine my life without you in it. He sank to one knee, and Eleanor made a small sound of surprise. Eleanor Ashford, Alexander said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. You are my home, not Thornwood, not any palace or estate. You. When I am with you, I am the truest version of myself. You have given me a gift I never thought I would receive. The gift of being seen, truly seen for who I am rather than what I represent. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, not the massive diamond that might be expected of a prince, but a delicate band of gold set with a deep green emerald surrounded by tiny white sapphires. This was my grandmother's ring, he said. She told me once that I should only give it to a woman who made me believe in love again. I had almost given up hope of ever finding such a woman, and then I found you. He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. Will you marry me, Eleanor? Will you be my wife, my partner, my home?" Eleanor was crying, she could not help it. But these tears were different from any she had shed before. These were tears of joy, of wonder, of a happiness so profound it felt like drowning and flying all at once. "Yes," she said, the word breaking on a sob. "Yes, Alexander. 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger and rose to sweep her into his arms, kissing her with all the passion and tenderness and fierce, protective love that burned inside him. And in that moment, surrounded by candlelight and flowers, neither of them had any doubt that they had found exactly where they belonged. The wedding preparations were a whirlwind of activity. Dressmakers and florists, diplomats and society matrons, all converging on Eleanor's life with opinions and demands and endless fittings. Through it all, Alexander remained her anchor, her refuge, the calm eye at the center of the storm. But there was one decision Eleanor made alone, and it surprised everyone who heard it. "St. George's Church," she said, when Alexander asked where she wished to be married. "Hanover Square." He understood immediately. "Are you certain?" "I need to reclaim it," Eleanor explained. "That church holds my worst memory. I want to replace it with my best one. I want to walk down that aisle again, but this time, I want to see you waiting at the end." Alexander kissed her forehead. "Then that is where we will marry." The morning of the wedding dawned cold and clear. A perfect December day. The sky a pale, luminous blue. Eleanor woke early and lay still for a moment, waiting for the dread, the anxiety, the sense of impending disaster that had plagued her on her first wedding day. It did not come. Instead, she felt only peace, a deep, settled certainty that this was right, that this was real. Her wedding dress was magnificent, a gift from Alexander, designed in Paris, with delicate lace and seed pearls and a train that seemed to flow forever. But it was the veil that made Eleanor cry when she saw it, white silk embroidered with tiny roses, a tribute to the simple flowers she had sewn onto her first wedding dress with her own hopeful hands. "He remembered," she whispered. Her mother fussed and wept and proclaimed herself the happiest woman in England. Her father stood stiffly by, uncomfortable in his formal clothes but undeniably proud. Even the servants seemed caught up in the joy of the day, pressing flowers into Eleanor's hands and wishing her every happiness. But when it came time to walk to the church, Eleanor made an unexpected announcement. "I will walk alone," she said. Her father's face fell. "Eleanor, it is not proper." "Father." Eleanor took his hands gently. "The last time I walked that aisle, I was a daughter being given away by her family, an asset being transferred from one man to another. Today I am walking to my future on my own 2 feet, as a woman making her own choice. I love you, but this is something I need to do for myself." He did not argue. Perhaps he understood at last that his eldest daughter had become someone he barely recognized. Stronger, more certain, more herself than she had ever been allowed to be. St. George's Church was filled to capacity, royalty and nobility from across Europe, society's most prominent families, diplomats and dignitaries, and curious onlookers who had read about the scandal and its remarkable aftermath. The morning light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting pools of color across the stone floors, and at the altar, waiting with an expression of such open love that Eleanor's heart ached to see it, stood Alexander. She began to walk. Each step was a victory. Each step reclaimed a piece of herself that had been stolen on that terrible day months ago. She was aware of the eyes upon her, the whispers, the speculation, but they did not matter. Nothing mattered except the man at the end of the aisle, whose smile grew brighter with every step she took toward him. When she reached him, Alexander took her hands and leaned close to whisper, "You are the bravest woman I have ever known." "I had a reason to be brave," she whispered back. "I had you waiting for me." The ceremony was beautiful, traditional in some ways, deeply personal in others. They had written their own vows, a break from protocol that had scandalized the traditionalists and delighted everyone else. Alexander spoke first, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Eleanor, when I first saw you, I was a man who had given up on love. I had convinced myself that duty was enough, that companionship was enough, that I could live my whole life without ever truly being known by another person. You proved me wrong." He squeezed her hands. "You saw me, not the prince, not the title, not the diplomatic mask I had learned to wear. You saw Alexander, and in seeing me, You gave me permission to be myself for the first time in years. I promised to spend the rest of my life seeing you in return. Not the scandal, not the gossip, not the woman others tried to tell me you were. The real Eleanor, brilliant and brave and endlessly surprising. My home, my heart, my love. Eleanor had to blink back tears before she could speak. Alexander, I came to this church once before believing that love was something I would have to learn to accept, a compromise, a necessity, a duty. I never imagined that love could be what you have shown me it can be, a choice, a gift, a homecoming. She took a breath. I promise to be your partner in all things, your comfort when you doubt yourself, your challenger when you need to grow, your shelter when the world grows too heavy. I promise to love you not for your titles or your wealth or your power, but for the man you are when no one is watching, the man who was kind to a broken woman on the worst day of her life, the man who looked at me and saw someone worth loving. Her voice broke slightly. I spent so many years believing I was not enough. You have taught me that I was wrong, not by convincing me with words, but by loving me with actions, consistently, patiently, fiercely. You are my home too, Alexander. You are everything. The priest pronounced them husband and wife, and when Alexander kissed her, the congregation erupted in applause. But Eleanor barely heard them. She was lost in the feeling of her husband's arms around her, in the knowledge that this was real, that this was her life now, that she had somehow found her way from humiliation to happiness. They walked back down the aisle together, the same aisle Eleanor had walked alone in shame months before, but this time she was not alone. This time her hand was clasped in Alexander's, and the eyes watching them were not cruel but joyful, not mocking but admiring. In the back pew, almost hidden in the shadows, sat Rosalind. She had not been invited. She had come anyway, slipping in after the ceremony began, watching from the darkness as her sister claimed a happiness Rosalind had tried so hard to destroy. Geoffrey was not with her. He had fled to the continent weeks ago, leaving his debts and his wife behind without a backward glance. Eleanor saw her as she passed. For a moment their eyes met. Two sisters, once close, now separated by choices that could never be unmade. Eleanor did not smile, did not wave, did not acknowledge Rosalind in any outward way. But she did not look away in hatred either. There was something in her gaze that might have been sadness or pity, or perhaps just the ghost of a love that had once existed between them. And then she was past, walking out into the winter sunlight with her husband, showered with flower petals and good wishes, stepping into a carriage that would carry her toward her new life. You saw her, Alexander said quietly, as the carriage pulled away. Yes. How do you feel? Eleanor considered the question. Free, she said finally. I feel free. Whatever she tried to take from me, she failed. I have everything I ever wanted, not because I fought for it or schemed for it, but because I stayed true to myself, because you saw something in me worth loving. She leaned against his shoulder. I do not hate her, Alexander. I pity her. She wanted so much, and she destroyed herself trying to get it. But that is not my burden to carry anymore. Alexander pressed a kiss to her hair. Where to now, princess? The title still felt strange to Eleanor, but not unwelcome. She smiled up at her husband, her heart full to bursting. Home, she said. Take me home. 1 year later, Eleanor stood in the gardens of Thornwood Hall, watching the spring sun set over the wild roses she had planted herself. Her hand rested on her rounded belly. 6 months along now, their first child, the heir to everything Alexander could give them, and the beginning of everything they would build together. The past year had been everything she had never dared to dream. Not perfect. No life was perfect, but full of love and laughter, of quiet mornings and passionate nights, of a partnership that grew stronger with each passing day. Alexander had proven himself to be the husband she had always deserved, attentive, passionate, endlessly supportive of her dreams and desires. And she had proven herself too. The woman who had once believed herself invisible, unremarkable, unworthy, had blossomed into a confident princess, beloved by staff and tenants alike for her kindness and warmth. She had taken over the management of Thornwood's charitable endeavors, establishing a school for local children and a refuge for women who had been abandoned by their families. She had found purpose in helping others who had suffered as she had, and in doing so, had finally laid to rest the ghosts of her own past. Arms wrapped around her from behind, and Alexander's chin came to rest on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured. "Everything," Eleanor said. "How different my life is now from what I expected. How grateful I am for every moment of it." "Even the terrible moments?" She turned in his arms to face him. "Especially those. If Geoffrey had not abandoned me, if Rosalind had not betrayed me, I would never have been standing outside that church, alone and heartbroken, when a stranger offered me his carriage and changed my life forever." Alexander smiled, that rare, genuine smile that he saved only for her. "I prefer to think of it as fate. I prefer to think of it as luck." Eleanor reached up to touch his face. "The luckiest moment of my life." He kissed her, soft and sweet, a promise renewed for the 1,000th time. A servant appeared at the garden gate, hesitant to interrupt. "Your Highnesses, there is a visitor." Eleanor frowned. They were not expecting anyone. "Who is it?" "Lady Blackwood, ma'am. She says she has nowhere else to go." Eleanor and Alexander exchanged a long look. Rosalind. After everything that had happened, after all the cruelty and manipulation, Rosalind had come to them. "What do you want to do?" Alexander asked quietly. "Whatever you decide, I will support." Eleanor thought of her sister, the golden child who had always gotten everything she wanted, who had schemed and betrayed and destroyed. She thought of the hatred she had once felt, the hurt, the desire for revenge, and she found that none of it remained. There was only a quiet sadness for a woman who had never learned that happiness could not be stolen from others, only built within oneself. "Show her in," Eleanor said. Rosalind looked terrible. Thin, pale, her once glorious beauty faded to a shadow. Geoffrey had abandoned her completely now, fleeing his debts and leaving her to face the creditors alone. She had lost everything, her position, her pride, her illusions about the world and her place in it. "I do not deserve your mercy," Rosalind said, her voice hollow. "I know what I did to you. I know there is no forgiveness enough for it, but I have nowhere else to turn." Eleanor studied her sister for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and took Rosalind's hands in hers. "You may stay," she said. "Not as my sister. That bond was broken, and I do not know if it can ever be repaired, but as a woman who needs help, and as someone I once loved." She squeezed Rosalind's hands gently. "I cannot forget what you did, but I choose to move forward. I choose to believe that people can change, can grow, can become better than they were. I hope, for your sake, that you prove me right." Rosalind wept, ugly, racking sobs that seemed to tear from somewhere deep inside her. It was not forgiveness, not really, but it was a chance, more than she deserved, more than she had ever given anyone else. That evening, after Rosalind had been shown to a guest room and left to rest, Eleanor sat with Alexander on the terrace, watching the stars emerge one by one. "You are remarkable," he said softly. "Do you know that? I am practical," Eleanor corrected with a small smile. "Hatred is exhausting. I would rather spend my energy on love." Alexander pulled her close, wrapping them both in a blanket against the evening chill. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked. "About any of it?" Eleanor thought about the question seriously, as she did all things. She thought of the humiliation at the altar, the pain of betrayal, the long months of doubt and fear. And she thought of what had come after, the love, the joy, the life she had built with this man who had seen her when no one else did. "Not one," she said firmly, "not a single one. Every moment of pain led me here, and here is exactly where I want to be." Alexander kissed her forehead, her cheek, her lips. "I love you, Eleanor, more than I have words to express." "Then do not use words," she murmured against his mouth. "Show me." And he did, with tenderness and passion and the fierce, protective love that had saved them both. Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, and the wild roses bloomed in the darkness, and two people who had found each other against all odds held on tight to the life they had built together. Sometimes Eleanor reflected as she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, the greatest blessings come disguised as tragedies. Sometimes the worst day of your life leads you to the best. And sometimes, when you least expect it, a prince takes your hand and shows you that you were worthy of love all along. You just needed someone brave enough to see it. She had been that someone for Alexander, and he had been that someone for her. And that, in the end, was the greatest love story of all.